In 1932, during the low point of the Depression, around 15 million Americans were out of work, and even more people were unemployed in other countries. The stock market crash of 1929 did not cause the Great Depression, but it remains a powerful symbolic starting point to the most significant economic disaster of the 20th century. On that dark day in October 1929, fortunes were lost, and fear of financial insecurity rose throughout the United States and the world. The stock market reached its lowest point ever and would not rise to its pre-depression levels for almost 20 years. The Great Depression was not an overnight phenomenon. It was a decade in the making. A case can be made for an even longer period focusing on the boom and bust natures of the American economy through the 19th and 20th centuries. The Treaty of Versailles, which arrived on the heels of World War I, is generally discussed as the progenitor of Hitler's eventual rise in Germany and the lead-up to the Second World War. However, it should be remembered that it had many unintended consequences for the global economy. One of the treaty's key provisions was that Germany was the principal nation to make reparations to the Allied nations. The German economy had been destroyed in the war, and starvation was a genuine concern in the country. Another key provision of the treaty confiscated key German territories, reducing the nation by about 10%. Much of the land taken away was the heart of German manufacturing. Asking Germany to repay such a vast amount of money was an impossible condition that would never be met. The impossibility of the task did not deter the Allies, especially France and Great Britain, from demanding payment. The French and the British were relentless in getting their money from Germany because the United States demanded repayment of loans it had given to the Allied powers. The Germans were crippled by the amount of money they needed to pay the Allies, and while France and Britain were not in such a crisis, the debt they carried after the war was hampering their economies as well. The solution relied on the United States and its willingness to forgive the war debt, and unfortunately, the United States decided not to budge, as U.S. President Calvin Coolidge took an unforgiving stance on European debt. His adherence to a strict, unrestrained position led to a long-term stagnation of global economic growth. Though much of the United States economy was healthy throughout the 1920s, the limits on foreign markets, because of their respective national debt, eventually hurt the United States economy. The first segment of the economy to feel the effects of the global slowdown was farming. The war's end saw the demand for U.S. farm products plunge as the European nations focused on reviving their agricultural production and becoming less reliant on foreign aid. The demand reduction was so severe that farmers were incurring heavy losses throughout much of the 1920s. The U.S. Senate attempted to help farmers by fixing prices on certain agricultural goods, providing funds for farmers not to cultivate in some instances, and for government to buy surplus goods to sell on the international market. On 2 occasions, Calvin Coolidge would veto the measure and claim that such measures were anti-American. The rest of the American economy was relatively strong throughout the 1920s, but by mid-decade, key industries were showing signs of slowing down. The coal and steel industries, 2 of the biggest parts of the economy, were reducing production, mainly because the nation's railways were not expanding at the same rate. In addition, they were experiencing a decline in ridership due to the rise of the automobile. New housing construction, a common indicator of economic health, also tapered off between 1925 and 1929. The slowdown of 4 industries employing thousands of workers was a warning sign that America's economic boom was approaching an end. However, other industries, especially the nascent auto industry, were booming. The conversion from a wartime economy to a more consumer-centered economy created a tremendous amount of growth. People were buying many novel products that American manufacturers were all too happy to keep producing. The aforementioned automobiles were continually setting new records for sales. Other household products like refrigerators, radios, and washing machines were new to many Americans who were glad to have these modern conveniences. To get these new products, more people than ever before were buying goods on credit. Unlike in previous generations, carrying personal debt was not considered dangerous, and the public was confident that the economy, and most importantly, the job market, would grow. As major industries started to slow down, the use of credit also slowed. By the later part of the decade, household spending had reduced significantly. While profits were still strong for corporations, wages rose insignificantly. Production of consumer goods did not slow down at the same rate, and like farming, a surplus was being produced by the end of the decade. However, with less money to spend and less willingness to use credit, the high production was unsustainable in the long run. The use of credit was also a significant factor in the growth of another part of the economy, the stock market. Before the 1920s, the market was essentially the providence of the upper class. In the 1920s, middle-class Americans began investing. For many, investing required more money than was on hand. Smaller investors bought on margin, where getting into the market involved purchasing stock with a certain percentage of the money coming from a loan. An investor could purchase with as much as 70% borrowed money or 70% on margin. If the investment went up, the margin would be paid back, with the rest of the return going to the buyer. If the investment did not rise, not only was the personal stake lost, but the borrowed money as well, which still needed to be repaid. Another practice that aided in market participation was speculating. For many new investors, little research was being done about the companies in which the money was being invested. Like real estate speculation in the 19th century, where buyers often did not even know the location of the land they were buying, new investors knew little about the companies they were financing. Such high-risk investments were acceptable if the market continued to rise. But if the market slowed or plunged, many would lose a lot of money. The volatility of the market in the autumn of 1929 was troubling to a greater amount of people than it ever had been. The exclusive domain of brokers and investment bankers had now become the concern of the middle class. Banks loaning money for margin buys were also more concerned with the market than they had been in previous generations. It would only take one particularly bad downswing to cause many Americans a great deal of hardship. When Herbert Hoover was inaugurated in March of 1929, he expressed optimism for the nation's future. The economy was steadily rising, and there was no need to worry about these things going south. By the end of the year, it was apparent that something was seriously wrong with the stock market and with the economy as a whole. The downturn that was even expected by some economists started on Thursday, October 24th. As a significant sell-off got underway, investors were worried that the market would fall too far. To preempt a sharp decline, J.P. Morgan infused a great deal of money into the market. The ploy seemed to work. After Morgan's influx of cash, the market stabilized. However, it was only a temporary fix. The following day, the market closed down again, but Morgan could not bail it out this time. The weekend offered some respite, but Monday saw another downturn. Tuesday, October 29, 1929, saw the greatest amount of stock trading in the stock market's history. The loss of volume was staggering. Brokers were selling at massive discounts in hopes of salvaging some money. In the end, it just made it worse. The more people sold at a loss, the more other investors wanted to escape a bad situation. By the end of the day, known as Black Tuesday, the market dropped nearly 12%, one of the largest one-day losses in the history of Wall Street. Black Tuesday caused great tremors throughout the economy and society, but people and institutions were not panicking just yet. The ripples needed time to expand. First, those who had been buying on margin were in a tough situation, as they needed to pay back their loans, and their losses made paying back the loans extremely difficult, if not impossible. Without the return of borrowed money, banks began to feel the pinch, and remaining solvent for day-to-day activities became an issue. Some banks were forced to close because of the shortfall. As news and rumors swirled about the banking industry's health, more and more people lost faith in their respective banks and started withdrawing their money. It was a destructive cycle. The more people that ran to the banks, wanting the money they had thought was unsafe, caused more banks to fail. By 1933, more than 9,000 banks had failed. The run on the banks accelerated the downward spiral of the economy. Spending had already been slower, but now with entire life savings wiped out, discretionary spending was non-existent. Businesses were starting to lay off large numbers of workers to reduce the losses they were beginning to see. While businesses were laying people off, they were also cutting wages and hours. As unemployment rose, meeting household expenses became a pressing concern for many families. Under such harsh circumstances, people needed assistance from outside sources. They turned to benevolent societies, churches, neighborhood organizations, and government agencies. As the crisis deepened, citizens called on the government to do more. The response to those calls defined much of the presidency of Herbert Hoover. The scale of the crisis demanded new ways of coping and new ideas about the role of government. The The ideas that had dominated American thought about the relationship between the economy and government were now viewed as outdated at best and dangerous at worst. Notions such as laissez-faire and self-made men were eclipsed by ideas of government regulation and community involvement. More than any other person in the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deal fundamentally changed the United States government.